Stepping off the plane felt strange. I thought I'd feel relief or excitement, maybe even a little peace, but all I felt was tension. 15 years in the military does that to you, I guess. You get used to carrying things you can't quite put down. The air smelled familiar, like home, but it didn't settle me the way I'd hoped. Ryan was waiting for me at the terminal, leaning against a railing with that same crooked grin he'd had since boot camp. "Home sweet home," he said, slapping me on the back. "Home is what you make of it," I muttered, already distracted. The ride back was quiet. Ryan filled the silence with talk about the changes around town, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was on the estate, my family's home for generations. I hadn't seen it in years, and I wondered how much had changed. Claire, my wife, had mentioned a few renovations, but I'd waved it off at the time. Now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have paid more attention. When we pulled up, I had to admit the place looked incredible. The Victorian house stood tall and proud, with ivy draping the sides like something out of a movie. The gardens, though, that's what threw me. The modest patch of flowers I remembered was gone, replaced by what looked like a resort centerpiece. There were hedges cut into perfect shapes, a sparkling fountain bubbling in the middle of the lawn, and, was that a camera? I paused, squinting. Yep, tiny cameras expertly hidden in the architecture. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral as I stepped out of the car. Claire was waiting on the porch, looking as radiant as ever. Her smile was warm, but something about it felt practiced. The kids, though, they were the real welcome committee. Lucas, Mia, and Nathan came barreling out of the house, their laughter cutting through my unease like sunlight through clouds. For a moment, I let myself relax, scooping up Mia as she wrapped her arms around my neck. "It's good to have you back," Claire said as she hugged me. "It's good to be back," I replied, though the words felt heavier than I intended. Inside the house, I barely recognized the place. The living room had been transformed into a sleek entertainment space, with a TV the size of a small car mounted on the wall. The dining room, once a cozy spot for family dinners, now looked like it belonged in a luxury lounge. It was beautiful, sure, but it didn't feel like home. "You've been busy," I said, my voice carefully neutral. Claire caught the tone and smiled. "It's all part of my new community initiative. Networking events, fundraisers, you wouldn't believe the turnout we've had." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. My instincts were buzzing. Something wasn't adding up. That evening, Claire threw a homecoming party for me. I didn't ask for it, but there I was, shaking hands and smiling politely as half the neighborhood filtered through my house. Among the guests was Tom Miller, a contractor Claire had mentioned once or twice. His slick smile and overfamiliar attitude immediately put me on edge. Then there was Mark Weston, my former lieutenant. "Ethan," Mark boomed, pulling me into a handshake that felt more like a test. "Mark," I said evenly. "Good to see you in one piece," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I tried to keep things running smoothly for you while you were gone. You know, helping Claire out with whatever she needed." I stiffened. "Helping how?" "Oh, you know," he said casually, checking in on the house, making sure everything was in order. I didn't respond. My mind was already filing away his words, turning them over like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. After the party, I retreated to my study. Or at least what used to be my study. Now it looked like a command center, complete with monitors displaying security feeds from every angle of the property. I sat down at the desk, the hum of the system filling the silence. My fingers brushed the edge of the keyboard as I stared at the screens. I told myself it was nothing, just upgrades Claire made while I was away. But the cameras, the changes, even the party guests, none of it sat right with me. That's when I noticed it. On one of the feeds, a shadow flickered at the edge of the frame. Too deliberate to be a stray animal. Too quick to be just my imagination. I leaned forward, watching closely. There it was again. A figure moving just out of view. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right here. The cameras, the new faces, even Claire's polished smile. It all felt like a mask. "What's going on in my house?" I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow moved again, and I sat back, my mind racing. Whatever it wasn't just my imagination. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, the warmth on my face a stark contrast to the chill creeping into my thoughts. Something about being back home didn't sit right, and today I was going to figure out why. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet, like the kind of silence that makes you second-guess what's around the corner. I made my way downstairs, and immediately, the differences hit me. The furniture was all wrong, sleek, modern, cold. Gone were the familiar scuffs and marks that made this house feel lived in. It was as if someone had erased all traces of the life I'd built here. The real shock came when I opened the basement door. The dim space I'd last seen filled with old boxes and cobwebs had been transformed into something straight out of a high-end magazine. A fully stocked bar gleamed under recessed lighting that could probably sync to music. Leather sofas surrounded a glass coffee table, and an enormous TV hung on the wall. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a statement. My mind flashed back to my time in the Rangers. I'd seen setups like this before, hubs for meetings and exchanges hidden behind the facade of luxury. It wasn't just a basement, it was a playground for secrets. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts. "Morning, Ethan." Mark Weston's voice carried through the house, too loud, too familiar. I made my way to the living room, where he was already sprawled out on my couch, scrolling through his phone like he owned the place. "You're here early," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Mark grinned, his confidence practically oozing. "Always something to coordinate," he said with a wink. His phone buzzed nonstop as he answered messages, muttering words like schedule, delivery, and drop off. He didn't bother explaining himself, and I didn't press. Not yet. My eyes drifted to Lucas, who clung to my side when he entered the room, his small hands gripping my arm tightly. "Dad, will you play catch with me later?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "Of course, buddy," I said, though my focus was still on Mark. Mia followed next, barely glancing up from her phone before settling into an armchair. "You're up early," I said casually, testing the waters. "Mark's got a meeting later," she replied without missing a beat. I froze. Why would my daughter know his schedule so well? Nathan shuffled in last, avoiding eye contact as I asked him about school. "Fine," he mumbled before disappearing upstairs. The uneasy feeling in my chest grew heavier. Something was deeply wrong. Claire moved through the house with her usual grace, but I caught the stiffness in her posture when I asked about the basement renovation. "It was overdue," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I nodded, letting it slide for now. Later, when the house was quiet again, I found myself staring at the security system Claire had insisted on installing months ago. It was top of the line, complete with archived footage. Pulling up the recordings, I braced myself for, I didn't even know what. At first, it was just late-night gatherings, people I didn't recognize coming and going. Then I saw Mark in the front doorway, handing a package to a man in a dark hoodie. The exchange was fast, precise. My stomach dropped. This wasn't normal. It wasn't innocent. Before I could dig deeper, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's bigger than you think. Watch your back." My heart pounded as I stared at the message. Who sent this? How did they know what I was looking at? The questions spiraled, but before I could answer any of them, I heard a faint knock at the front door. My blood ran cold. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouette of someone standing outside, unmoving. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to stay put. Who was it? What did they want? And how long had they been standing there, watching me? The week dragged on like an old wound that refused to heal. Every glance at my kids, every casual word from Claire, felt tainted with an invisible weight I couldn't shake. But it wasn't until Aaron Diaz showed up that my suspicions hardened into certainty. Aaron wasn't just any soldier. I'd mentored him, seen him through some of the toughest challenges in his early career. So when he approached me with his shoulders hunched and his voice low, I knew whatever he had to say wasn't going to be easy to hear. "Ethan," he began, glancing over his shoulder as though someone might be listening. "I've been meaning to talk to you. Something's been bugging me well, since the last time I came to one of those gatherings Claire hosts. I felt my stomach twist. What about them? Aaron hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I saw something I shouldn't have. People exchanging things, envelopes, documents. At first, I thought it was just some political or charity thing. But then I recognized one of the guys from a classified intel briefing. He's not someone who should be mingling with civilians, Ethan. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping. Why didn't you report this? Aaron's face darkened. I tried. A week later, I had that training accident. You remember? The one that put me out of commission for 2 months. Now I'm not so sure it was an accident. His words hit me like a brick to the chest. I'd written that injury off as bad luck, but hearing it now, with this context, painted a very different picture. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, half-heard rumors, and the unsettling shifts I'd noticed in Claire. Aaron's hand gripped my shoulder. Ethan, I think it's bigger than just some side project. Whatever they're doing, it's deliberate, calculated, and you need to be careful. I nodded, my jaw clenched. Thanks for telling me. Aaron's words reignited my need for answers, and I knew I couldn't do this alone. That's where Emily Green came in. Emily had always been meticulous, a personnel officer who knew deployment schedules better than anyone. If Mark's involvement stretched beyond my home, she'd have the records to prove it. When I asked for her help, Emily didn't hesitate. This stays between us, Ethan, she said as she handed over a stack of files. Of course, I assured her, flipping through the pages. The patterns jumped out immediately. Odd scheduling changes, sudden reassignments, and extended deployments that didn't align with any operational need. And at the center of it all, Mark Weston. This doesn't make sense, I muttered. It does if you think about it like a chessboard, Emily said, her expression grim. Mark's moving people around like pawns, and I don't think it's random. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy fog. If Mark was orchestrating this, how far did it go? What else had I missed? That's when Dr. Elise Porter entered the picture. Elise wasn't just a colleague. She was someone I trusted implicitly. Her background as a medical professional on base gave her access to records others couldn't touch. I didn't plan on asking her about my family, but when the conversation turned that direction, something in her expression stopped me cold. Elise, I said, my voice steady but firm, is there something you're not telling me? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her clipboard. Ethan, you're not going to like this. I've seen some troubling DNA results tied to your name. They're not yours. Not biologically. I froze. What are you saying? I'm saying, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, that your children, none of them are biologically yours. Her words felt like a sledgehammer, shattering the ground beneath me. My kids, Lucas, Mia, Nathan, were my world. The idea that they weren't mine tore at something primal inside me. But as the initial shock faded, a sharper focus took its place. This wasn't just about me. This was about control, manipulation, and betrayal on a scale I hadn't imagined. When I confronted Claire later that evening, her composure wavered for the first time. She stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug, her gaze darting to the window as though searching for an escape. Claire, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I know what's been going on. Aaron told me what he saw. Emily gave me the deployment records. And Elise told me about the DNA tests. Her face paled, but she quickly masked it with a forced calm. Ethan, you don't understand. This isn't what you think. Then explain it to me, I demanded, stepping closer. Explain how my home became a hub for whatever this is. Explain why Mark's name is all over military schedules. And explain why my children aren't mine. Claire's hands trembled as she set the mug down. It's not what you think, she repeated, her voice cracking. Everything I've done, everything Mark's done, it's for the community, for stability. You've been gone, Ethan. You don't know how bad things have gotten. We had to make choices. Choices. I shot back, my voice rising. You call this betrayal a choice? You let Mark take over my family, my house, my life, and you justify it as some noble cause. Her polished facade cracked further. You were gone, she shouted, tears brimming in her eyes. We needed help. I needed help. Mark stepped in when you didn't. Her words stung, but they didn't weaken my resolve. If anything, they steeled it. This wasn't just about her. This was systematic, deliberate, and it needed to be stopped. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, realizing for the first time that the Claire I'd loved and trusted was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize. Someone willing to sacrifice everything for reasons I couldn't yet understand. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every last one of them. The realization hit me hard. I couldn't take this on alone. Claire and Mark's operation was bigger than I'd initially thought, and every move I made had to be calculated. If I rushed in without a plan, I'd lose the element of surprise. I needed allies, people I could trust to help unravel the layers of deceit and corruption embedded in my home. Carlos Vega was the first person who came to mind. Carlos wasn't just a forensic accountant. He was the kind of guy who could sniff out a discrepancy in a sea of perfectly balanced books. We'd crossed paths years ago during a military investigation, and I knew if anyone could help follow the money, it was him. When I called, Carlos didn't hesitate. Send me everything you've got, he said, his voice as steady as I remembered. And Ethan, be careful. People who pull strings like this don't usually appreciate being unraveled. Within days, Carlos uncovered what I'd feared. The basement renovation wasn't just a poorly disguised vanity project. It was a funnel for money laundering. The contracts were inflated, with funds being siphoned off to accounts tied to shell companies. Mark Weston's name popped up repeatedly, but he wasn't acting alone. There was a network of beneficiaries, each taking their cut. Next, I reached out to Logan Marshall. Logan was a former ranger who'd transitioned into investigative work after his service. If anyone could dig deeper into the players involved, it was him. When I explained the situation, he didn't need convincing. Send me the names, Logan said. I'll see what I can find. It didn't take long for Logan to identify patterns that pointed to something far bigger than Mark's involvement. The individuals linked to the transactions had connections to regional politics, local law enforcement, and even some private contractors who'd worked with the military. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a systemic operation hiding behind the veneer of my family's home. But it wasn't just the money or the paper trails. It was the human element that truly began to unravel the story. Patricia Lane, a retired counselor who'd known my family for years, called me one evening. Her concern was palpable through the phone. Ethan, she said, her voice tinged with worry, I've been meaning to talk to you about the kids. They've been different. Lucas seems overly anxious, like he's afraid of doing something wrong. Mia talks about adult things she shouldn't even understand yet. And Nathan, he's withdrawn, angry. I'm worried about what they've been exposed to. Her words cut deep. I'd already noticed the changes in my kids, but hearing it from Patricia validated my fears. The environment Claire had created with Mark's influence wasn't just toxic. It was harmful. Then there was Olivia Vaughn. Olivia had been a party planner who'd worked with Claire in the early days of her so-called social club. When I reached out, she didn't hold back. Claire liked to talk, Olivia said with a bitter laugh. She liked to brag about how much control they had. The parties weren't just for fun. They were networking events for their agenda. I even recorded some of her conversations, just in case things ever went south. When Olivia sent me the recordings, I sat in stunned silence. Claire's voice came through clearly, boasting about how the social club had influence where it mattered, and how they were shaping the community for their benefit. It wasn't just manipulation, it was calculated, strategic exploitation. Every piece of evidence painted a darker, more disturbing picture. My home wasn't just a base of operations, it was ground zero for a web of corruption that had taken root while I was away. With Carlos, Logan, Patricia, and Olivia on my side, my focus became razor-sharp. This wasn't just about exposing Claire and Mark. It was about dismantling the entire operation and protecting the people caught in their web. I started drafting a plan, meticulously outlining each step. Carlos would trace the money to its final destinations, tying it to key players. Logan would dig deeper into the connections and provide the evidence needed to confront those involved. Patricia and Olivia would focus on the human side, helping to document the psychological and social impact of Claire's actions. But even with a solid team, the risks loomed large. If Claire or Mark caught wind of what I was doing, they'd close ranks, and the operation could vanish before I had the chance to expose it. I needed to stay 2 steps ahead. As I pieced together the final details, I couldn't help but think about the person I'd once trusted with my life. Claire had been my partner, my confidant. Now, she was the architect of a deception that had torn my family apart. But this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about justice, about restoring integrity to my home and protecting the innocent people tangled in their web. By the time I finished drafting the plan, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't going to be easy, but I'd faced harder battles before. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my kids, for the people who'd been wronged, and for the chance to reclaim the life I thought I'd lost. The next step would be the hardest, putting the plan into motion and confronting the people who'd orchestrated this. I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about winning, and I wasn't about to lose. The strike wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, calculated, and devastating. I knew that if I wanted to dismantle what Claire and Mark had built, I needed to hit them where it hurt, quietly, but with enough force to send shockwaves through their entire operation. The first move was delivering the evidence to Colonel Arthur King, the base commander. King wasn't just a figurehead. He was a man who built his career on discipline and integrity. If anyone would act swiftly and decisively, it was him. I walked into his office with a thick folder under my arm, the culmination of weeks of investigation. "Ethan," King greeted, his sharp eyes studying me as I entered. "This better be good." "It's worse than good," I said, placing the folder on his desk. "It's necessary." King opened the folder, his expression hardening with each page he turned. The documents laid everything bare: Mark's manipulation of deployment schedules, the misuse of military resources, the financial discrepancies tied to inflated contracts, and the transformation of my home into a hub for unauthorized activity. When he finished reading, King leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "This is big," he said, his voice low. "And if even half of this holds up under scrutiny, heads will roll. Starting with Weston's." "They need to roll," I said firmly. "This isn't just about me or my family. This is about the uniform and the people who trust it." King nodded, his expression unreadable. "Leave it with me," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "You've done your part. Now it's time for me to do mine." That was step 1. Step 2 was getting the public involved. Samantha Brooks, an investigative journalist I'd worked with years ago, had been eager to help when I first reached out. She had a reputation for uncovering stories that made powerful people uncomfortable, and this one was right in her wheelhouse. Samantha didn't just write an article. She wrote an exposé that tore through the operation like wildfire. The headline alone sent a chill through the community. "Inside the Shadow Network: How Corruption Exploited Military and Civilian Trust." Her piece detailed everything we'd uncovered. She described Mark's manipulation of military resources, Claire's role in hosting networking events that were fronts for illegal dealings, and the financial web that tied it all together. Samantha even included snippets from Olivia Vaughn's recordings, giving readers a first-hand glimpse into the arrogance and entitlement driving the scheme. By the time the article went live, it was impossible to ignore. Military forums lit up with outrage, and local news stations picked up the story almost immediately. Samantha's work didn't just shed light on the operation. It put a spotlight on every individual involved. The fallout was immediate. Law enforcement, spurred by the public outcry, moved quickly to question key players like Tom Miller and Victor Chavez. Tom, whose fingerprints were all over the inflated renovation contracts, folded under pressure, implicating others to save his own skin. Victor, tied to the financial transactions Carlos had uncovered, tried to play dumb but couldn't explain away the evidence. Meanwhile, Claire and Mark found themselves increasingly cornered. When investigators confronted Mark, he did exactly what I expected. He threw Claire under the bus. "It wasn't my idea," he claimed, his voice frantic in a recorded interview that later made its way to Samantha. "Claire pushed for it. She said we needed to act while Ethan was gone. I was just following her lead, but it didn't matter." The evidence we'd gathered painted a picture of their shared guilt. Their roles intertwined so tightly that neither could escape the blame. The house, the place where all of this had started, became a focal point of the investigation. What had once been a family home was now a crime scene, its walls holding the secrets of deals made and trust betrayed. I watched from the sidewalk as investigators swarmed the property, their presence both a relief and a bitter reminder of how far things had fallen. For me, this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the integrity that Claire and Mark had so carelessly discarded. But even as I stood there, watching the operation unravel, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest. This house had been my sanctuary, my safe haven. Now it was a symbol of everything I'd lost. The fallout spread like ripples in a pond. Claire and Mark's names became synonymous with betrayal, their social circle evaporating as friends and colleagues distanced themselves. My children, though still too young to fully grasp the depth of what had happened, began to see cracks in the stories Claire had fed them. Through it all, I stayed focused. Carlos, Logan, Patricia, and Olivia kept me grounded, reminding me that this fight wasn't just mine. It was ours. Together, we'd exposed the truth, but the battle wasn't over. The justice system would have its say, and I was determined to see it through to the end. As the days passed, I found myself walking through the house one last time before the investigators locked it down. The rooms felt hollow, stripped of the warmth they once held. But as I stood in the doorway, I realized something important. This house didn't define me. The family I'd fought to protect, the values I'd stood for, they were what mattered. And no matter how deep the betrayal had gone, I wasn't going to let it define my future. The strike had landed. The operation was in ruins. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The house, once a beacon of betrayal, now stood for something greater. As the legal battles unfolded and the dust began to settle, I made one final decision about the mansion. It couldn't remain a monument to the darkness that had taken root within its walls. It needed a new purpose, one that would overwrite its tainted history. With the help of my allies, the property was transformed into a rehabilitation center for veterans. The renovations erased every trace of Claire and Mark's influence, replacing it with bright spaces, therapy rooms, and recreational facilities designed to help those who'd served rebuild their lives. On opening day, I stood among a group of veterans, watching as they walked through the doors of a house I once couldn't bear to call my own. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Claire and Mark's fall from grace was as swift as it was final. The evidence we'd gathered left no room for doubt, and their legal battles ended with guilty verdicts. They were ostracized from the military community, their reputations tarnished beyond repair. Every attempt they made to regain footing was met with resistance from those they'd betrayed. Their names became synonymous with selfishness and manipulation, and wherever they went, the weight of their actions followed. My children, however, were my greatest concern. Lucas, Mia, and Nathan were too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, and I was determined to protect them from the darker truths. Marion Cruz, our loyal nanny, stepped up in ways I hadn't anticipated. She became their rock, providing stability and warmth in the midst of chaos. I made the difficult choice to maintain my distance from them. As much as it pained me, I knew the life I led, and the truths I carried, could create a shadow they didn't deserve to live under. Instead, I worked to secure their futures through carefully managed trust funds, ensuring they would never lack for anything. I wanted them to have a chance to grow up free from the betrayals that had rocked our family. In time, I saw the resilience in them that I'd always admired in my fellow Rangers. Lucas found joy in the simple things, his laughter slowly returning. Mia grew more confident, her sharp mind thriving under Marianne's guidance. Nathan, though still reserved, began to open up, finding solace in drawing, a talent I never knew he had. Watching them heal, even from a distance, reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. The Ranger community, too, emerged stronger from the ordeal. Colonel King spearheaded reforms to tighten oversight and prevent similar betrayals. Logan and Carlos lent their expertise, creating systems that would flag the kinds of patterns Mark had exploited. Patricia worked closely with counselors and families, ensuring that no one else would be left in the dark as I had been. Though I carried scars, some visible, others buried deep, I found solace in knowing that I had done everything I could to protect those I cared about. My fight had exposed a network of corruption, but more importantly, it had reminded me of the strength that comes from standing together. As I walked the grounds of the rehabilitation center one evening, the sound of laughter and camaraderie filling the air, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the life I'd imagined, and it wasn't without pain. But it was a life where I had reclaimed my integrity, safeguarded my family's future, and found a purpose greater than myself. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to betrayal. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where others could rebuild what they'd lost. And as I stood in its shadow, I knew that no matter how far I'd been pushed, I'd never let the darkness define me. The battle was over, but the lessons would stay with me forever. 10 years had passed, but the lessons of those dark days stayed with me, sharper than any memory. Standing before a group of fresh-faced recruits at the Ranger training facility, I could see their eagerness, their drive to be part of something greater. These were men and women who would soon wear the uniform with pride and bear its weight with honor. They needed to understand that the threats we face aren't always from the outside. "Let me tell you a story," I began, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "It's not the kind you'll find in manuals or war stories, but it's one you need to hear, because the enemy isn't always on the other side of the line. It's sometimes standing right next to you." Their eyes were fixed on me, their focus unbroken. I recounted the events of a decade ago, leaving out the names but not the hard truths. I spoke about vigilance, integrity, and the insidious nature of betrayal. I told them how easily trust can be weaponized, how even the closest bonds can be exploited if you're not careful. "And here's the takeaway," I said, my voice steady. "Being a Ranger isn't just about what you do out there. It's about who you are every single day. Stay vigilant. Not just for the enemy you know, but for the one you don't see coming." The room was silent when I finished, the weight of my words hanging in the air. One recruit raised a hand. "Sir," she asked, "how did you stay strong through all of that?" I paused, considering her question. "By remembering what I stood for," I said finally, "and by fighting not just for myself, but for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves." That was the truth. The operation I'd conducted a decade ago hadn't been about revenge, though the pain had made it tempting. It was about justice, reform, protecting the values that mattered most no matter the cost. The Victorian mansion, once the heart of the betrayal, had transformed into something extraordinary over the years. It now stood as a beacon of hope, a thriving rehabilitation center where veterans could find solace and rebuild their lives. Every time I visited, I saw the laughter, the camaraderie, the quiet strength in the people who'd come through its doors. That house was no longer a scar. It was a symbol of resilience. My children had grown into remarkable young adults. Lucas, always the dreamer, had become an aerospace engineer, chasing the stars he'd once drawn on the backs of napkins. Mia, sharp and determined, was a lawyer advocating for social justice, her fiery passion unstoppable. Nathan, ever the quiet artist, had found his voice through his paintings, which now hung in galleries across the country. They thrived because they were free from the shadows of the past. I'd kept the darker truths from them, ensuring they could grow without the weight of betrayal dragging them down. Marianne, their loyal caretaker, had been their steady guide, and I never stopped being grateful for her role in their lives. As for Mark and Claire, they had disappeared into obscurity, their names whispers of cautionary tales. They lived small, unremarkable lives, reminders of what happens when greed and deception take precedence over honor and trust. Their downfall had been inevitable, but it had never been my focus. Justice had been served, and the rest was for them to reconcile or not. On the 10th anniversary of the Rehabilitation Center's opening, I stood on its steps, looking out at the crowd gathered to celebrate. Veterans, families, and supporters filled the lawn, their smiles a testament to what we'd built together. As the speeches began, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. This journey had changed me, it had scarred me, but it had also reminded me of what it meant to stand firm in the face of betrayal. I'd lost a great deal, but I'd gained something greater: clarity, purpose, and the knowledge that even the darkest chapters could lead to redemption. As the crowd applauded, I stepped forward to say a few words. This place, I began, gesturing to the house behind me, once represented everything I thought I'd lost, but today it represents everything we've gained. Resilience, hope, brotherhood. The applause swelled again, and as I looked out at the faces before me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This was my legacy. Not the scars, not the betrayal, but the strength to rebuild. My family's future was secure, my values upheld, and the Rangers stronger for the lessons learned. For a Ranger, that was victory enough.